The name change that Yaakov experiences from Jacob to Israel, Yaakov to Yisrael, and the various ramifications and the spiritual ramifications. So that's the subject of our little discussion here this morning. So one interesting thing that we begin with is that this is not the first name change that we experience within the book of Genesis. Both Abraham and Sarah had their names changed. Avram was first Avram, and then it becomes Avraham with an additional hey. And Sarah is first, she's Sarai, which is my minister, and then she's Sarah with the hey, which means she's minister over everybody. And so both Avram and Sarah, the hey represents an expansion of their mission. Avram initially means Avram, father of Aram. Aram is the region where he was from. And Hashem says clearly in the Torah explains the reason for the name change. Explicitly, it says, Ki av hamon goyim netaticha, I placed you a father for multitude of nations, for many nations. So the hey is an expansion. By the way, the letter hey is actually, if you look at the letter, it represents expansion. It has a width and a length, as opposed to the yud, for example. So in the Kabbalah, hey represents bina, which is the expansion of the original spark of the new idea. So hey represents expansion. Both Avram and Sarah have their names expanded, meaning their mission expanded, and therefore hey added to their name. Okay. In fact, there's a verse that says as follows. The verse says, anyone who calls Avraham, if he calls him Avram, meaning you drop the hey, or if you refer to Sarai as Sarah, says the Talmud, that's a violation of a positive commandment. That's what the Talmud says. Why? Because the verse says, your name shall no longer be called Avram. So if your name shall no longer be called Avram, means that if someone calls Avram, that's a violation of the verse. Okay. And same thing with Sarah, by the way. Then when you come to Jacob and Yisrael, again, first the angel and then God says, your name will no longer be called Yaakov, rather Yisrael, because, and he gives the reason, but the bottom line is there we have a different story, because over there, the Torah doesn't say anybody who refers to Israel as Jacob, refers to him as Jacob, it's a violation of the commandments. This is a little bit funny. In fact, so the Talmud asks this question. The Talmud says, how come if somebody refers to Israel as Jacob, it's not a violation? The Talmud gives a technical answer. What's the technical answer? The technical answer is, look, the Torah itself refers to Yaakov as Yaakov even after the name change. So therefore, if the Torah can refer to him as Yaakov, so could we. That's the answer. But that answer is not an explanation. That answer is just an indication, just a proof that his name is indeed Jacob, both Yaakov and Yisrael, both Jacob and Israel. And when the Torah said your name is Yaakov, no longer shall your name be Yaakov, it means not that he shouldn't be called Yaakov the way it meant that through Abraham, but it means it shouldn't be exclusively Yaakov. So that's the proof. But the question is, how come? How come when Avram transfers from Yaakov to Israel, what am I saying? When Avram transfers from Avram to Avraham, that's a change, and you can't go back. Whereas Yaakov and Yisrael, it's a change, it's an expansion, but you could go back, and in fact, both names are legitimate. So that's sort of the background, and whatever we're going to explain about Yaakov and Yisrael, the bottom line is what they both have to be connected in a way of. They both have to be in a way that both of them, both the names are still valid and even necessary. So that's the background, and we're going to give the Hasidic interpretation, but there are many other interpretations. But like I said, any interpretation is going to have to explain how both names apply. And you see that in the Torah also when we study on Sundays, especially now, when Jacob is reuniting with with Joseph. It's very interesting to see when the Torah uses the term Yaakov, when the Torah uses the term Yisrael, it's telling they're both true, they're both legitimate, and each one has its own place. So that is the introduction. Comments or questions, welcome. Otherwise, we'll plug in the computer and we'll begin. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen and we'll read the Rebbe's essay inside. He'll say it better than I will, that's for sure. So you'll get firsthand experience. Okay, section 1 is what I said earlier by heart, so we'll try to do it quickly. This week's Torah reading relates how God changes Yaakov's name, declaring, your name will no longer be Yaakov. Instead, your name will be Yisrael, will be Israel. Our sages compare this verse. Our sages compare this verse with the verse, your name will no longer be Avram. Instead, it will be Avraham, right? It's almost the exact same. It is the same makeup of the verse, same words. And state that a person who refers to Avraham by the name Avram commits a transgression, for it is written, your name will no longer be Avram. Why then, ask our sages, does one not commit a transgression when he refers to Yaakov by that name, rather than by the name Yisrael? After all, it is also written, your name will no longer be Yaakov. So that's the Talmudic question, right? Look at footnote number 3, if it will show up, footnote number 3. Brachot, chapter, page 13. You want to check it up. That's the question. So what's the answer? The Talmud over there gives the answer. What does the Talmud say? Our sages explain that the renaming of Yaakov was different than the renaming of Abraham. From the time God gave Abraham his new name, the Torah refers to him with that name alone. In other words, once the name changed, he is referred to exclusively with the new name. The Torah refers to him with the name alone. Okay. With regard to Yaakov, by contrast, even after God gave him the name Yisrael, the Torah continues to refer to him as Yaakov. So that's the proof that it's permitted. But like the Rebbe is going to say, okay, that's proof that it's permitted, but that's not an explanation of why it's permitted. What is the rationale for this distinction? Why does the Torah still refer to Yaakov by that name, even after he was given the name Yisrael? Okay, so now we're going to give the Hasidic interpretation, but before we give the Hasidic interpretation, if somebody wants to share any interpretation that they heard, now is a wonderful time. So typically, we say that Yaakov, I think, is the name of struggle, and Yisrael is the name of being a minister, overcoming the struggle. And I guess throughout history, so let's talk about the names within even later in the book of Genesis, in the story of Joseph. When Jacob is in mourning for his son, and the period of time where his son Joseph is away from him, torn away from him for 22 years. There, the Torah doesn't refer to him as Yisrael, the minister over his circumstances, because there he's very much in pain and very much in the struggle. However, every now and then within the story, certainly after Jacob, certainly after Joseph, he's reunited with Joseph, he's referred to as Yisrael, but even before, when he's hopeful in the story, he's Yisrael. And then later, when he goes down to Egypt, the last portion of Genesis begins, Vayechi, the name of, and he lived, Vayechi Yaakov. Jacob lived, because at the end of the day, he's in Egypt, not in Israel. So he's not in control completely of his circumstances. So that's the general idea. And the reason why both names exist is because throughout Jacob's own life, but also throughout Jewish history, we had both those periods. There's periods of struggle and there's periods of triumph, and both are there, and therefore both names are valid. But now we're going to get to the Hasidic interpretation, and the Hasidic interpretation is going to say that basically there are two spiritual missions of the Jew. There are two states of being, and both are necessary. And therefore, both those names, Jacob, we interchange between those, we go back and forth between those two names, because both those spiritual missions are necessary, and both are still part of Jacob's own spiritual service, and therefore the spiritual service of every Jew. And we're going to play it out, and we'll see what happens. So here we go. In Chassidut, it explains that the names Yaakov and Yisrael reflect two different modes of divine service. Every Jew must possess both traits, For there are times when a Jew must carry out his divine service in the path reflected by the name Yaakov, and other times in which the divine service must reflect the path of Yisrael. Although Yisrael is a superior name, alluding to a loftier spiritual level, at certain times and in certain situations, the divine service of Yaakov is also necessary. In other words, it's not a question of what name is greater. It's not a question of what name is greater. Yisrael is greater, but just because something is greater, it doesn't necessarily mean you don't need the lower form of service as well, and therefore he's referred to as Yaakov even after Yisrael. Give me just one moment. I apologize. Okay, let's get down to the business, to the interpretation. Here we go. The difference between the modes of service identified with Yaakov and Yisrael can be described as follows. The name Yaakov indicates that the blessings he received from Yitzchak were acquired through deception and trickery. Through cleverness, Yaakov was able to snatch Yitzchak's blessings from Esav. Yisrael, by contrast, reflects a higher rung. For Israel, there is no need to secure a blessing by craftiness. Instead, they are granted him with nobility and in a revealed manner. What is this saying? So this comes from the interpretation of Rashi, because you see, it's funny. Yaakov's name was changed really twice. At first, when he struggles with the angel tells him, "No longer will your name be called Jacob but Israel." And Rashi interprets it to mean that in the future, God is going to change your name, and that's actually what happened. Because later, God Himself changes the name. And now Rashi says, what does the name mean? Lo Yaakov. Yaakov comes from the word, could be Akov, could be to trick, to be clever and to trick. So nobody will say that you got the blessings because of trickery. Rather, they're going to say, Yisrael, you got the blessings with nobility. That's Rashi's interpretation. In this context, the difference between Yaakov and Yisrael, Yaakov is someone who has to trick to receive the blessings, and Israel is a person who gets the blessings without any trickery. What does that mean? And how does it apply to us? So here's the Hasidic interpretation. The Hasidic interpretation is going to say that the Jew also engages in trickery. And I know we don't like it doesn't sound right because it has a bad rap, that word trickery. But if you get to the core of what the word trickery means and what the concept of trickery is, especially if you understand it spiritually, then you see, yes, indeed, that's what we're referring to. So, what is trickery? What is trickery? Trickery is that on the outside, you have one intention, but inside your intention is different. So I present myself as your friend. I present myself that we're on the same team. But when it comes to the moment of truth, I act on my own interests. That's one form of trickery that we're going to discuss right now. What does that mean in the spiritual service of the Jew? The Jew is invested in this world. And in this world, a person is not supposed to just survive, but a person is supposed to be ambitious and try to achieve success, even in the material sense. And when you look at a Jew and you look at somebody else, you could say they're both exactly the same. They're both looking for material success. From the perspective of the soul, that's trickery. Because, yes, we are looking for material success, but we have a hidden agenda. I don't mean to get all the anti-Semites excited here, but we have a hidden agenda. What's the hidden agenda? Hidden agenda is that when we want material success, we want the material success for a spiritual purpose. So we appear, what is trickery? The outside doesn't reflect the inside. On the outside, it looks like we want material success, and we are actually invested, and we put an effort, and we really desire the material success. But when it comes to the moment of truth, what do you use the material success for? Oh, we have a hidden agenda. It's for spirituality. That's going to be Jacob. What is Israel? We'll see it in a minute. Israel is the Jew where there's no materialism to begin with. And we don't mean that a person is on Yom Kippur, he's fasting, but we have something even more interesting. On Shabbos, for example, The food itself, for the person, Shabbos, you're supposed to eat good food, and you're supposed to engage in pleasure, and you're supposed to enjoy the Shabbos and have delight on the Shabbos. But on Shabbos, the delight itself, the food itself, is a mitzvah. So during the week, when I engage in material experiences, it's a physical act. I'm using the physical act for a spiritual purpose. That's Jacob. What is Shabbos? Shabbos is no physical act because it's not physical. Why is it not physical? You're eating cholent, you're eating gefilte fish. Yeah, but it's a mitzvah. The food itself, eating on Shabbos, is a way of serving God directly, not indirectly. So in that sense, Jacob and Israel is both is the Jew on Shabbat and the Jew in the weekday. Now we understand why we go back and forth, because of course Shabbat is holier, but the goal of creation is to be during the weekend, to sanctify the weekend, to sanctify the world. So in that sense, that's why even after Shabbat, we go back once again to the weekday and the cycle continues. So here we go. The actions of the patriarchs are assigned for their descendants. Again, a rabbinic statement that Maimonides talks about all the time, that the stories of the patriarchs are really a sign, meaning they paved the way for us. Providing Jews in every generation with guidance in their divine service, many of the defining spiritual characteristics of Yaakov's mode of service are reflected in the story of his receiving the blessings his father intended for Esav. The meaning of the verse never departs from a straightforward interpretation. Thus, the blessing given by Yitzchak to Yaakov, the dew of the heavens and the fat of the earth, refer to material prosperity. To receive these blessings, Yaakov and Rivka were willing to take life-threatening risks and employed various forms of deception. For example, Yaakov had to wear the clothes that Esav had taken from Nimrod, even though Nimrod had caused the entire world to rebel against God with his kingship. What was the purpose of these tactics? To extract the sparks of godliness contained in these material entities and elevate them to holiness. In other words, if you look at the story, it says that Rebekah gave Jacob the garments of Esav, the precious garments of Esav that were with her in her home. And the Medrash says, one second, what happens here? Esav has precious garments. What are those precious garments? Why would he give it to his mother, not to his wives? Long story short, the Medrash says that it's really the garments of Nimrod, who was mentioned in the book of the portion of Lech Lecha of Noach as the first king, the first king with an empire, with an expanding empire, and he was the king that, according to the Medrash, begins the process, initiates the building of the Tower of Babel. In any case, his name Nimrod actually means rebellion, a rebel, rebellion. Nimrod is to rebel. So the point here is that Jacob has to put on the garments of Nimrod. It's also, which is the garments of Esav, also represents spiritual descent. You're getting involved with the person who represents rebelliousness against Hashem. And what are you doing it for? To get the blessing. What's the blessing? Fat of the earth and dew of the heaven, which means material blessing. Why does Jacob and Rebekah so insist and put their life on the line spiritually and in order to get material blessing? So the Kabbalistic answer is, they're not into material blessing. They're looking for the sparks of holiness that are in the material blessing. In other words, when Jacob wants fat of the earth, he wants a lot of grain and wine, etc. He wants bounty. It's not because he needs the grain, that too, but it's because there's a spiritual energy within the grain, which he's going to use for the service of God and elevate it and correct the world. And of course, the same is in our life as well. This serves as a lesson for us in our divine service. A Jew must approach eating, drinking, and other material activities with a certain measure of craft and deception. What does it mean, craft and deception? If Jacob was the deceiver, we also have to deceive. What does it mean to deceive? In a positive sense. Again, I don't think you should put this in the cover of the New York Times. Jews engage in deception. But in a spiritual sense, we are. What does it mean, deception? So let's see. How does a person perpetuate a fraud? He does not reveal his true intent. He begins by appearing to follow the path which his opponent desires. But at a crucial point, he changes course and does what he desires, although it is against the other's wishes. This is the way a Jew should approach material activities. On the surface, he is involved in material activities like everyone else. He eats, drinks, and deals in commerce and the like. And that's not just physically, it's also emotionally. The person invests his desire and his passion and his creativity to succeed. However, he engages in these activities for the sake of heaven, not for any material purpose at all. In other words, the purpose is not exclusively for the material, but it's for a higher purpose. He wears Esav's clothes, but that's only clothing, that's only external, but carries out all his material activities with a sense of inner purpose to extract the sparks of holiness contained in these material entities and elevate them to holiness. Now we're going to say that's Yaakov. That's Yaakov. What's Yisrael? Yisrael is a different story altogether. The divine service of Yisrael is quite different. The blessings for material prosperity granted him are conferred upon him with nobility and in a revealed manner. In other words, with Yisrael, there's no deception. In other words, there's no materialism to begin with, because you could see right away that what he's doing is actually a mitzvah. He doesn't have to conceal the godly intent of his material involvement, for material concerns do not create a conflict for him. For him, there is no concealment of their godly source. To cite an example, by simply eating his Shabbat meal, a Jew is performing a mitzvah. This is different from the task of refinement which he performs during the week. During the week, a Jew practices deception. Every time he performs a physical activity for a spiritual purpose, he eats, but it is with a deception because he is eating for the sake of heaven, to elevate the food to its source and holiness. On Shabbat, by contrast, the physical activity of eating itself reflects holiness. So this is not just the time of the week, it's deeper. The question is, am I in a space that I want material possessions? Am I in a space where materialism is important? When I'm in the state of Yaakov, during the week I'm in the spiritual state of Yaakov, of course materialism matters. I want to make money, I want to achieve success, I want to drive a nice yacht. All this matters to me. Now, there's deception, because deep down I say, why do I want it? Oh, you know what? I'm going to use it for a holy purpose. So there's an inner purpose, so I want it for a holy purpose. When it comes to Shabbat, in the spiritual sense of Shabbat, I don't want the materialism. I just want the mitzvah. Eating on Shabbat is a mitzvah, so we're going to eat on Shabbat. So it's a spiritual state, it's a different spiritual state of how important is materialism for you. During the week, either literally or figuratively, in other words, in the state of mundane, before the holiness of Shabbat, I want the materialism. It's meaningful to me. It is materialism. There is deception, because on the external part of my soul, that's what I want. Deep down, there's a deeper meaning. And I engage in it in deception because I am using this for a higher purpose. Shabbat, there's no materialism to begin with. In other words, I don't want the gefilte fish because it's gefilte fish. I want it because it's a mitzvah. That's the spiritual state of being on Shabbat. So this is a little bit about Shabbat in general, and it ties into Yaakov and Yisrael. And we can continue and talk about how this applies to the names, to the words that the angel told Yaakov. We can keep going. Okay, go ahead, Vicky.
Thank you, Rabbi. I don't know if you're going to be talking about it, but while you were talking about the spiritual meaning of deception, in that sense, I was trying to apply it to the case which we talk about on Sunday, where Jacob was convinced, that kind of convinced. So that was a deception in another way. So he was kind of pretended that he was convinced, that he kind of accepted the fact that his son died.
Right.
But in a sense, he wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah. So
also the other question is, was there analysis done on every single case in the Torah where the names are used under this angle?
Maybe there has been, I don't know, but I think that certainly people are interested in these parshas of the story of Joseph, and people look to the names. I don't know if they explain every single one, but people are sensitive to this. Absolutely, yes. Regarding your first point, deception again, we don't mean deception in the negative sense. You mean the concept of deception, the abstract, which is basically layered, which basically there's layers and the outer layers don't fully reveal the inner layers. And you talk about Jacob sort of believing that his son Joseph was killed, but also harboring hope. And that's also some degree of inconsistency. And in some ways, it's where the conscious mind and the subconscious mind don't reflect each other, right? Because logically, he says, all the evidence shows that Joseph is gone. But deep down, he feels like maybe he harbors some hope that Joseph is still alive. So in some sense, when he is in mourning and he's tearing his garments and he's acting in mourning, in a way, that's deception. In a way, but defined in this way, it's deception because that his external behavior does not reflect fully his inner state of mind. And his inner state of mind is more complex. And I think today we understand that people are complex. And almost there's always layers. I once spoke to a very smart rabbi, and he told me, he didn't have to tell me, but people almost never tell you what the problem is. They almost always tell you an external problem, but there's a deeper problem, right? You know the very famous story. There's a very famous story of one of the Rabbi Soloveitchiks in the previous generations. I don't remember exactly which one, but in short, the great story. Someone comes to before Pesach and he says, "Rabbi, could you fulfill the obligation of drinking 4 cups of wine with drinking 4 cups of milk?" And the Rabbi Soloveitchik said, "This is a very difficult question. I don't know the answer. It's going to take me hours to figure this out. I don't have the time. So you know what? Here's a check. Here's a bag of money. Here's money. And go buy yourself wine. Oh, by the way, buy matzah and meat." And he sent him up with a pack of money. So the rabbi's wife was very intrigued. She said, "I don't understand. Everyone knows you can't fulfill the obligation of drinking 4 cups of wine with milk. So why could you answer the question?" He says, "Because that wasn't the question. The question was, Rabbi, I can't afford wine. I can't afford matzah. I can't afford meat, because if he had meat, he wouldn't be drinking milk. So his question was, what should I do about the fact that I can't afford my needs for the Seder?" So I answered him the question. In other words, we understand today that when people operate, there are many layers of consciousness and many layers of awareness that are taking place, and some of them simultaneously. So in that sense, when we say deception, it doesn't have to be bad deception. Deception means that you're layered. And during the week, the Jew is layered because on the outside there is ambition and there's desire, and he wants to succeed, and money matters, and materialism matters, and yes, but it's still not the full story, because the Jew also is in some sense a deceiver, meaning there's deeper layers and deeper layers of consciousness. I want the material success for a higher purpose. I want to eat lunch so I can serve God, but the lunch, I still like lunch. I still want a good lunch. That's the state of mind of Shabbat, of the weekday. State of mind of Shabbat is there's no lunch here. I feel holiness. I want to connect to Hashem. The way you connect to Hashem in Shabbat is not only that your mind finds delight with Hashem, but also your body finds delight with Hashem. And because your body only understands a food, so the food itself is the mitzvah to serve God and delight in the Shabbat with the meal. So that's very different than the state of mind on Shabbat. So that's that, and there's no deception there, because the outer activity of engaging in material pleasure is an expression of the inner intention of the soul, which is to connect to spirituality. And during the week, it's much more complicated, because there's a place in our consciousness where the materialism really does matter. On the other hand, we also, even in that state, there's still a struggle, and there is deception. Right? Now, what is easier? So there's the next paragraph we're going to talk about, that Jacob, there's a spiritual struggle. On if you're level of Israel, there's no spiritual struggle, which is better. Okay, we can talk about that later, right? Tanya talks about struggle. There's an advantage to struggle. So that's what we're saying. That's what we're saying. We're saying that we have both elements are important, and therefore we don't shift. We don't seek to become Israel and abandon the name Yaakov. Rather, we understand that both names are important for our spiritual mission. Okay, I think we'll do one more paragraph, number 3, and we talk about how the nature of struggle. Here we go. So this, we're going to turn to the 4th book of the Torah, and we're going to turn to the blessings of Bilam, who was hired to curse the Jewish people, and instead he blesses the Jewish people. And here there's a beautiful discourse from the Alter Rebbe also on Yaakov and Israel, because there Bilam gives a blessing, and he employs both those terms of Yaakov and Israel. Now, when you look at the surface, you say the reason why he's employing both terms because it's poetic. He says Yaakov and Yisrael, 2 different names. You could be repetitive. It's more poetic. But now we're going to say everything is precise in the Torah. And therefore, let's look carefully at what Bilam says about Jacob, and let's look carefully at what he says about Israel and how they reflect each and how it fits the spiritual intention and the spiritual state of mind that we've been talking about. So let's continue with number 3. The distinction between the levels of Yaakov and Yisrael. Whoops, what did something happen here? The distinction between the levels of Yaakov and Yisrael can be clarified based on the Maimer, the discourse of the Kutei Torah, that interprets the verse. God does not perceive sin with Yaakov, nor does he see struggle within Israel. That's the verse of Jacob. Lo hivid aven v'Yaakov. God saw no sin in Jacob, and he sees no amal. Some translations translate as iniquity, but amal is much more like effort or labor or toil. So he sees no struggle within Israel. So what does that mean? Jacob has no sin. Israel has no struggle. What does that mean? Jacob has no sin, but he has struggle. Israel, if you're on the level of Israel, there's no struggle. Because on the level of Jacob, materialism is important for you. And the idea to use your material blessings as a tool to serve God, that's an effort, that's a struggle. But if you're on the level of Shabbat, if you're on the spiritual level of Shabbat, you're the spiritual level of Israel, then there's no struggle, because the materialism to you at that state of mind, your materialism to you is not important. What's important is the relationship with Hashem. And the materialism is just a tool to express that relationship with God. So on that level, there is no struggle. Now, not everybody's on that level, certainly not all week. Even on Shabbat, I'm sure there are degrees. And later we'll say there's a tzaddik and there's a Baal Teshuvah. The tzaddik is generally the level of Yisrael. Baal Teshuvah is generally the level of Yaakov. But again, the point here is that it's not, the model is not, we're not saying that one is higher than the other. They're two different modes, and both are important for our spiritual mission. So here we go. On the level of Yaakov, there is no sin. He does not transgress. His thought, speech, and action are flawless. There is, however, the need for struggle. Yaakov must struggle not to sin, because the veiling and concealment of godliness present him with challenges that he must work to overcome. Therefore, Yaakov was given the title, my servant, a term that connotes labor and toil. Right? The verse says, Yaakov Avdi, Jacob, my servant. And the commentaries explain, and the Kabbalah explains, that this servant and this child, and there's two different modes of service of God. Sometimes we say, like we say on Rosh Hashanah, im kebanim, im kavadim. If we're like sons, if we're like servants. What's the difference between a son and a servant? A son usually, or could be on the level that the son wants to help the parents. It's not considered a service. It's not work. But a servant doesn't want to serve. He's only serving because he forces himself, or he's forced to by circumstances. But the bottom line is he doesn't identify fully with the task. So here we're saying Yaakov is my servant, because a term that connotes labor and toil. For refining one's animal soul requires such efforts. However, God does not perceive sin with Yaakov, for ultimately Yaakov summons up his inner strength and overcomes his Yetzer Hara. So what is Jacob? Not someone who sins. Jacob is someone who struggles with the concealment and overcomes the struggle, but it's still a struggle. With regard to Yisrael, by contrast, there's no need for struggle. He does not have to exert himself and contend with his Yetzer Hara, evil inclination. Yisrael had already shown mastery in the past tense. Kisarita means you have become a master with angels and men and prevailed. The challenges are behind him. He has already triumphed over and nullified all the concealments and veils that obscure godliness. Therefore, the divine service of Yisrael does not involve a struggle with forces opposed to holiness. Instead, his efforts are dedicated solely to reaching higher and higher within the domain of holiness itself, going from strength to strength. Okay. Now we're going to have an interesting takeaway. The interesting takeaway is going to be as follows: that even when a person is in the state of mind of Yaakov, even when there is a struggle, a person has to be aware of the Yisrael. Yes, right now I have a struggle. Right now materialism is meaningful to me. And right now it's a struggle between materialism and spirituality. But the fact that I know that there is a place within me that is Israel, that sometimes I can tap into the level of Israel, and in Israel there's no struggle, that helps me even now know that I have the struggle, so I'll be able to overcome it. How will I be able to overcome it? How the certainty that I'll be able to overcome the struggle? Because part of me, when you come to the deeper part of me, there's no struggle to begin with. And that knowledge helps me overcome even now. And there's a beautiful song that some communities sing after Shabbat. Chabad generally doesn't sing Zmirot, so we only sing the one song from the Arizal by each of the 3 meals. But most Jewish communities sing many Zmirot, many songs. And then there's a song that they sing Saturday night, Al Tira Avdi Yaakov, fear not my servant Jacob. And what happens? Why that song? It's a whole long song. The idea is like this: during the week, we're not my servant Jacob, we're Israel. And we're not God's servants, we're God's children. And again, children means we feel connected, we want to serve Hashem. Now it's transitioning from Shabbat to Saturday night to the days of the week. Now we're moving into the state of being of Jacob, of Israel, of Jacob and struggle. So we're saying now we have to say, do not fear, because even though right now there's a struggle, but since part of you is Israel, part of you is above the struggle, therefore you'll be able to overcome the struggle. So we'll read the final paragraph and we'll conclude with that. Here we go. Where are we? 7. Based on the above, we can appreciate the implication of a liturgical hymn sung at the Melava Malka meal, Saturday meal, the meal that greets that escorts the queen, Melava Malka. On Saturday night, you're supposed to eat a meal, and during that meal, many communities sing a song, and the chorus that keeps repeating itself is "Do not fear, Yaakov, my servant." As explained in the Kosher Deception on Shabbat, the Jewish people are on the level of Yisrael. Then there is no need for strenuous efforts to refine the world's material substance. As the Shabbat departs, however, Jews must once again make the transition to the level of Yaakov, my servant, resuming their mission of refining material entities in the 6 weekdays that follow. Therefore, every Jew is then assured from above, do not fear Yaakov, my servant. He is told not to fear, to descend to the level of Yaakov, my servant. Those words are more than a charge not to be fearful. They are empowering, providing a person with the strength to proceed without fear and carry out his divine service with happiness. This happiness, in turn, makes the person's task easier and hastens its completion, enabling him to see generous recompense for his efforts, including the ultimate reward, the coming of the era, which is all Shabbos and rest for life everlasting. This is from the Mishnah, which talks about when Mashiach comes, it's going to be a day of all Shabbats. What does it mean it'll be Shabbat all week? It means a spiritual state of Shabbat where there's no struggle with the negativity that we'll be able to experience the entire week in the Messianic era. So that's the story in short. Of course, we didn't read everything inside, but I think we got the main points. The main points is that we today are both, the Jewish people are both Jacob and Israel, because we have to move between those realities, and reality where materialism is not even enticing. And that's Israel, that's Shabbat. That is above the fray, above the challenge. But then we have to be in the state of deception, which means we descend to a space where the materialism is important, and when we try to achieve success, but yet the purpose is not the materialism per se, rather it is to be able to overcome and transform the materialism, take out the sparks, and use it for a higher purpose. So, Toda Rabah, thank you for joining. Shabbat Shalom.